What does 16% and financial independence have in common? In today's video, I'll explain the one number that shows you how to become financially independent and how you can use this for yourself, starting with a quick brain teaser. Consider two people who are planning for their future and eventually want to quit their jobs with enough investment earnings to not have to work. One is your average worker who earns around 40,000 and saves 20% of their income, so 8,000 a year. The other is a successful city type, earning 150k annually and also saving 20% of their income. This results in them saving 30,000 per year instead, clearly far more than the first. If both of these people want to become financially independent and keep their expenditure as it is today, who do you think will get there first? The surprising answer is that they will both do this at exactly the same time, despite having wildly different incomes, spending, and savings, because their savings rate is identical. The savings rate is an incredibly powerful tool for financial independence and for retirement because it can incorporate everything from earnings, savings, and spending all together, as well as predicting the number of years to financial freedom. I'm going to prove to you that this is the case with a little bit of maths, but if you're not super numerical, don't let it put you off because we'll go right from the start and hopefully it will be easier than you expect. The start is incredibly basic. We have earnings minus spending equals savings. See, I told you it wasn't going to be too bad. There's already implications here though. You're spending money while working, but if this means that you stop working, then you're still going to need this amount of money to live. For the purposes of this exercise, we're going to assume that the amount is the same and doesn't change once you quit, which it may well do, but it's good enough for now. We can write this another way that makes it a little bit easier later on. It's the same thing, but earnings is equal to the amount that you spend plus the amount that you save. This is common sense. So next question, how much do we actually need? In this case, we're going to use the 4% rule. There has been a lot of noise over the years about this rule, which basically says that to safely withdraw from a pot of money invested in primarily stocks, and by this we really mean index funds, on a 30-year time horizon, you can sell and withdraw 4% of the portfolio each year and be fine in the vast majority of cases. The ins and outs of the 4% rule are really too broad for this video, so for now we'll just use it, but as it's simply a term in the overall equation, it can just be changed as you like to suit our own risk profile. So this then determines the size of the pot that we need. If 4% of the overall pot value gets us to our spending, and that is obviously annual spending, we can flip this on its head by seeing what our pot should be by taking our spending that we're doing and dividing this by 4%. We divide both sides by 4% and we get left with the pot value. 4% as a division is easier represented as 25 times the spend. This is just easier to look at, so we'll rearrange it in this particular way. From here, we can also work out naively how long it's going to take us to save up the pot of money. This is our pot value. It's going to be the number of years multiplied by how much we save, and that's going to give us our total pot value. So now we basically have three important equations that we're going to use to figure this out. And what happens if we combine 2 and 3 together? Because these are both just different values for the retirement pot. So if we take this value from over here and we combine it with this one, these two things equal each other because they're both equal to the pot value. Put this another way, we can put this in terms of spending and we can combine this with the equation 1 that we had earlier. So this is the number of years times the savings divided by 25 equals our expenditure. So we can put that back in up here. So what we end up with is a new equation using all three of these that we've already had. Earnings equals, we're going to put this in there. So this is years times savings, all divided by 25 and plus savings again. That's just this equation here. And we've just added this spending equation into this. Now the last thing we want is we want this in terms of years, but it's kind of buried in here. It's a little bit complicated. So what we're going to do first is we're going to divide everything by the savings amount. So we're just going to get rid of that term out of here to start with, and we're going to cross this out and turn this into 1, and then earnings are going to be divided by savings over here on this side. We're then going to move the 1 over, so we have earnings over save minus 1, and that equals years divided by 25. So if I timed everything by 25 on both sides, that gets us to the number of years it will take us to save up the retirement pot that we need to spend every year as we are right now. Now, what's really interesting about this final equation here is this term here, this earn divided by save. Because if we think about the savings rate, like we were just talking about previously, that, if we just put this over here, that is how much you save divided by how much you earn. If you save half of your income, then this is going to be 50%. Because your savings will be 50 and your earnings will be 100, whatever that might be. This earnings might be 40,000 and savings might be 20,000. So that's going to get you to 50%. Now you can see this term here, basically just this, but flipped the other way up, which means it is 1 divided by this, which is 1 over the savings rate. So we can rephrase this whole thing as 25 times 1 over the savings rate minus 1, and that equals the number of years that it's going to take us to save up that pot. Notice here that the value of our pot and the headline figure of our earnings has completely disappeared. It's not really relevant overall because of how everything is interlinked through the savings rate itself. This is the number that determines when you can become financially independent, not earnings, savings, or expenditure on their own, but because they are intrinsically interlinked. And the savings that you're making now has an implication for how much you're spending, which then also implies how long you need to save to get back to the level of spending that you're doing right now. One thing that we haven't taken into account here though so far is compounding, as clearly when you save up, you'll be hopefully getting some return on the money that you've banked so far. Using the basic calculation that we did, we can chart the number of years against the savings rate that we use, and even something fairly good like 25% of earnings saved gets you a ridiculous number of 75 years, which is clearly too high. I won't bother putting the maths in for this one as it's a bit more messy, but hopefully you get the idea at this point. If we add in the compounding section for each year's worth of savings, this dramatically decreases the time required to get to financial independence. For my investment returns, I'm using 7%, which is my preferred middle ground investment returns rate, given that it matches the long-term average S&P index return after inflation, and here every year that we contribute to the pot, it grows by that 7%. This clearly has a much greater influence on the longer time horizons when it comes to financial independence or retirement, whichever one you're thinking about, and less so for the more extreme ends of the early retirement spectrum, simply because compounding has less of an effect below about 10 years or so. In those cases, what you put in directly tends to be more relevant than any compounding effects. Doing this, we can now see that the years to financial independence flattens dramatically on these longer timescales, so that a savings rate of 25% now results in 28 years instead, which is much more palatable. So what's the deal with the 16% thing that we started off this video with? As it turns out, 16% is the minimum savings rate required to reach what is conventionally considered early retirement using a 7% investment return, but it is by no means extreme. Using the assumptions we've made, this corresponds to the 35-year time horizon for financial independence. Someone who starts at the age of 21 would, at least in theory, be free of the requirement to work by the time they were 56. Given that the average retirement age in the UK is 65, many would certainly consider this 9-year head start to be early. Of course, the more that you manage to earn, the easier it is, at least in theory, to cut spending and increase the savings rate. And if you manage to get this up to 50%, you're looking at a 15-year time horizon instead, which is certainly extremely short when compared to the vast majority of people. The fascinating thing about the savings rate is the way that it encapsulates both savings and expenditure at the same time, and the knock-on effect that this has. By increasing it, you're showing that not only can you save more, but that you can also spend less, which in turn means the size of the pot that you require to support that spending is also less, shrinking the number of years of saving required to reach it. Looking across the range of examples, we have our basic 16% savings rate with the 35-year time horizon that we looked at before. Increasing this only 9% to a savings rate of 25% instead knocks off 8 years from the date of financial independence. This really is a very long time for not that much of a sacrifice for most people. Just to demonstrate the point, I have now included the 75% savings rate line as well as the 50% that we looked at with 7 years and 15 years respectively, so that you can see the full scale of what might be possible. Of course, with the basic cost of living in general, typically only those with above average paying jobs will be able to reach these higher savings rates, simply because there's more room to make the gap between expenses and earnings as wide as possible. But even if you can only reach 10, 15 or 20% at the moment, one of the things that we've assumed here is that you'll never make more than you do now, which is also very likely not to be true. Financial independence is a marathon, not a sprint, so it takes discipline and commitment over the long term without sacrificing so much that you'll end up having a miserable life. Be deliberate about what you spend on, and you'll be on the path to freedom sooner rather than later. If you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.